Good afternoon, everybody. I am Dan Fiorino. I'm director of the Center for Environmental Policy in the School of Public Affairs at American University. Our subject today is technology opportunities for improving environmental equity and justice. This is part of a project that we've been doing now with funding support from the New York Community Trust. And we've enjoyed working there with Arturo Garcia Costas from the New York Community Trust, and we've gotten some additional support from the Intel Corporation. We're also working with two partner organizations. It's a slightly different emphasis in this project, but we'll be hearing a bit from the Environmental Protection Network and the Union of Concerned Scientists. So this is part of a larger project called Environmental Protection for the 21st Century, putting equity at the top of the agenda. So our particular goal from the American University perspective is to think longer term over the next couple of decades about where environmental protection should be going, and in particular to promote equity, fairness, and environmental justice. And there are two strands in this project. One is the subject we're talking about today on technology opportunities for promoting environmental equity and justice. The other part is building the environmental workforce of the future toward that same end, with a particular focus on building a more diverse public environmental workforce. So we have a three-part agenda for you today. We're going to tell you something generally about the project and hear from our partners. We have, I think, it will be a very interesting panel. We thought we'd use this to highlight some of the technologies that have particular application for promoting equity and justice. And so we'll hear from people working on some different aspects of technology. And when we say technology, you know, it's not really, the emphasis isn't the technology per se, but the way that we can use technologies, sort of the social context, the access to expertise, the role of communities and others in owning or being able to make use of data. So keep that sort of broader perspective in mind. So we'll hear generally about the project. We'll hear about our panel, which Joanne Shatkin from Vireo Advisors will chair. We'll hear some remarks from Bill Riley. William K. Riley is the chair of our advisory panel for this project, and will share some thoughts with us. And then the last 40 minutes or so, we wanted to get any feedback that we can, comments or questions on the project. We have some questions we'd like to ask generally, so comments on those or on anything else related to the project would be very helpful. So with that, let's hear from our two project partners. First, we're going to hear from Michelle Roos, who is the Executive Director of the Environmental Protection Network. Michelle?
Thank you so much, Dan. And thank you so much to American University, our partners at the Union of Concerned Scientists, the panelists, and as Dan mentioned, our mutual funder, the New York Community Trust. I'm Michelle Roos. I'm the Executive Director of the Environmental Protection Network. We're composed of just about 550 EPA alum that have been volunteering our time to protect public health and the environment. And this project that Dan just referred to, we often talk about, creating this environmental protection for the 21st century and how American University, Union of Concerned Scientists, and EPN all work together in different ways to promote different ideals and recommendations. We talk about it like passing the football, where each of our individual organizations' work feeds into and improves the effectiveness of the others. So for EPN's part in that project, we focused much of our 2020 efforts on resetting the course of EPA, which was a project where over 100 EPA alum, and a handful of them are on this call today, from across the country, wrote 17 papers on all aspects of EPA's work to not only repair the damage under the Trump administration, but fix elements and approaches at the agency that have been in need of repair for a very long time. Our funder, New York Community Trust, often talks about this moment as a real phoenix rising from the ashes moment in history, and certainly taking advantage of technology that promotes equity in a real meaningful way, promoting community science and other efforts is a key part of that rebuilding process. We're really excited to listen to the panelists today and learn from their experiences. One of our papers, called Incorporating Environmental Justice in Every Aspect of EPA's Work, touches on some of these topics today. And in addition, some of our work proposed for year 2 of this project is connecting our volunteers, which again, hundreds of folks across the country, to community organizations, environmental justice organizations, and NGOs to provide technical assistance and other capacity building support as needed. And I do think that today will help us do that work better. Thank you again.
Okay, great. Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, I do recommend the Resetting EPA report. It's really a rich source of ideas and best practices and lessons that I think are valuable to anybody interested in the field. So next, we have Jacob Carter. Jacob is a research scientist with the Union of Concerned Scientists. Jacob also is a member of our work group on diversifying the environmental workforce of the future. So he's contributing in that way as well. But today he's representing what UCS is up to as part of this overall project. So Jacob.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. And I want to say thank you to EPN as well as their mutual funder, the New York Community Trust. And today I just wanted to give you a bit more information about what we have done so far with this project and a little bit about where we're going. So I have just a few slides. Our part in the project really focuses on the science-based decision-making element for environmental protection. And this, of course, is really important because during the past 4 years in particular, but even before the prior administration, we saw a really large number of attacks on federal science, where we saw politicization in really critical decisions that are based on scientific information. And so that gave us some indication that there were likely some weaknesses in these science-based processes and also scientific integrity policies that are being implemented across a number of agencies to protect federal scientists and the work that they do. So we published a report of recommendations to strengthen scientific integrity and evidence-based decision-making processes across federal agencies, as well as a number of fact sheets to highlight recommendations for strengthening those processes at various agencies and on various topics like equity and environmental justice and conflicts of interest, for example. We published a paper in Science to highlight a number of these recommendations that I'm happy to say that the Biden-Harris administration have picked up. There is a scientific integrity memorandum that was signed by President Biden on January 27th. And actually tomorrow, there's a task force that was formed that will be meeting for the first time to review scientific integrity policies and what happened under the prior administration, with hopes to have some guidance and advice on how to strengthen those processes and the scientific integrity policies. So this is the first time that that's really been undertaken by the federal government, so it's really great to see. Another aspect of this work that we have been working on is looking at scientific capacity across federal agencies as a whole. So this is from a report that we published earlier this year, looking at scientific capacity at various agencies that was lost during the prior 4 years. And what we found is that while scientific capacity and federal scientists were not lost at all agencies, there were some agencies in particular, like the Environmental Protection Agency, where we found a good number of scientists lost. So moving forward in this work, we are going to be working to provide some outreach events, webinars, information from former and current federal scientists, fellowships, internships, to really drive a number of early career scientists into these positions once they open, as they are obviously really good opportunities to go into, with a focus on many early career scientists from underserved institutions that have previously really somewhat been looked over. And so we'll be continuing that work in the future, and that's all I have to report today. So thank you all for listening.
Okay, thank you, Jacob. UCS is doing important work. For those of us who believe in science and democracy, we appreciate all the efforts that you're making. So it's my pleasure now to hand the program over to our panel. We've been looking at opportunities to use technology to promote equity and fairness in several categories of technology. Enhanced air monitoring is one, ways of using geospatial analysis, advanced analytics, synthetic biology, advanced manufacturing. So a fairly broad screen now. And at this point now, we're going to start to focus in on some particular applications of technology and the context in which they're used and ways of using them more effectively. But we will be hearing about most of those categories in this panel discussion now. And these are some, I think, some really interesting issues that will help us use technology more effectively. So our moderator for this part of the program is Joanne Shatkin. Joanne is president of Vireo Advisors. She is chair of the Technology Opportunities Work Group that's working with us on this aspect of the project. And just as important, Joanne is a member of the Program Advisory Board for the Center for Environmental Policy. So I will hand this over to Joanne to lead our panel discussion. Joanne.
Thanks, Dan. Welcome to all of you. Very happy to be having this conversation today, important and timely. And thrilled to be working with three of the work group members who are leading very interesting efforts related to technology opportunities that we're going to discuss a bit further. So we have Shizuka Shay, who is assistant professor of chemistry at Trinity University in Washington. We have David Padgett, who's associate professor of geography at Tennessee State University. And we have Chris Thayer, who is the director of the Chemical and Pollutant Assessment Division at EPA. And each of us are going to, I am going to give a brief, in addition to sort of organizing this discussion and keeping us talking, we'll also talk a bit about advanced manufacturing and technologies and how those might fit in. So first we'll start off with each of the discussants talking about the topic that they're working on briefly, and then we'll get into more depth on the specific issues for those technologies and the opportunities that come along with them and other issues that arise. So Shizuka or Zooks, let's start with you.
It's an honor to be here. I'm Shizuka Shay, also known as Zooks, and I am doing air quality monitoring for some communities in Washington, D.C. that suffer a disproportionate amount of pollution, largely because of where they actually live. And so these are non-FRM monitors that I'm using and working with the communities to empower them with those data.
So what can you tell us about the air monitoring that you're doing, in a few minutes or so?
Right. So right now I'm just looking at particulate matter. PM 2.5, of course, is the really fine stuff that goes deep down into your lungs. That is leading to all sorts of cardiovascular and lung disease, all sorts of health outcomes, lower life expectancy. I'm also monitoring PM10, which is a little bit larger, but since one of the communities I'm working with is right next to a concrete batching plant, and also a lot of construction, the main dust component from that is PM10.
And how do you work with you said you're working with communities. How are you engaging with them?
One community I worked with was Ivy City, and in that neighborhood, there's already a lot of heavy vehicle parking and diesel. There's a nightclub there at the time was a lot of bus parking. So they were experiencing a lot of black carbon and diesel particulate matter. So we monitored PM 2.5 and black carbon there, and were able to show that the levels were higher, right, than EPA regulation. So the folks in that community took those data to DC Council to ask them not to put another pollution source, which would have been a bus depot parking lot, not to put that in their neighborhood, and they succeeded in that. Another neighborhood I'm working with is next to that concrete batching plant, and they have also taken some of those data to talk to DC officials to let them know that air quality is being monitored in the neighborhood. And it turns out that DC put in a new monitor for PM 2.5 closer to their neighborhood, a federal regulatory monitor.
So you're collecting these data and then sharing them with the community, and then the community is using them for.
That's right. I think given the technology that's out there now, though, what the community would really love would be monitoring with alerts on their phones, for example, so that they know exactly what's happening in real time and that they're able to adjust their behavior accordingly. For example, if we know that down by the concrete batching plant, there's a big plume of dust going out, right? That's not a great time to take your dog out for a walk. And if we can have these kinds of behavior changing technologies, things that really inform citizens so that they can make choices, I think that will also protect their health.
Terrific. Great. David, why don't you tell us a bit about the work that you're doing?
Good morning. Am I able to share my screen at all? I'm Dr. David A. Padgett, Associate Professor of Geography and Director of the Geographic Information Sciences Lab at Tennessee State University. And Tennessee State University is an historically Black college and university located in Nashville, Tennessee. And I'm happy to say this seminar coincides with my urban geography class. So several of my students are here attending. Thank you very much for attending, students. So my project one of the projects that I'm working on is democratizing geospatial technology. And so I've been a GIS user for about 30 years. Started out using rapidograph pens and paper and light tables, and now we have mapping is ubiquitous, from Google Maps to Waze to a variety of things. But in terms of empowering environmental justice communities, GIS is a great tool. However, there is somewhat of a learning curve, and so like I said, my effort is to work with communities to democratize the technology. This project is supported by the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice and the Ethical Geo Fellows Program through the American Geographical Society. And so I developed a framework connecting myself as the quote unquote expert to community-based organizations, including one in Washington, D.C. I've done some work in the Buzzard Point community, also some community-based mapping. And we connect the, older, more mature populations who are not so tech savvy with young people. And so we've had a lot of success connecting the older generation that grew up like me with 4 channels on the TV set. The TV went off at night, no internet, no phones, no lights, no whatever that song is for Gilligan's Island. But but the young people, the youth mappers, have really helped the older folks with the technology. We do on the ground training, get people to understand the technology. And one of the things that we do in addition to, well, we primarily do asset mapping. In my 30 years, I've done a lot of pathology mapping. Where are all the dumps? Where are all the liquor stores? Where's all the crime? I've done a lot of pathology mapping. And then communities started to say, well, there's good things in our communities. Why don't we map that? Why don't we make more playgrounds like this good one that's over here? You know, there's an urban garden over here. How do we get more of those? And so that's what we started to do. And this is from the Buzzard Point. When I did the Buzzard Point is being heavily gentrified, and that's an understatement. And they are fighting back using maps. We start off not just low tech, no tech. Let's just walk the community. What's out there? You know, we drive past things every day that we don't see when we walk. And then we ask questions. We might see a vacant lot. Is that an eyesore or an asset? What could this vacant lot be? Could it be an urban garden? What about this underutilized property? We could say, oh, this is a mess. It's ugly. It's terrible. Or we could find ways to invest. In fact, another HBCU, Morgan State University in Baltimore, which is my hometown, and it's my father's alma mater, they actually invested in a nearby strip mall and have students doing lots of work there. And like I said, we want to empower communities. This is a case, the Wedgwood community in Pensacola, Florida. It's a Black community that is surrounded by 13 open landfills and borrow pits. How does that happen? Well, some people didn't pay attention to those 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments for a while. And Black people in this area didn't get a chance to vote, certainly didn't get a chance to block landfill placements. But to add insult to injury, the county was going to build a 4-lane highway straight through this community. This is the community that you saw where I was on the ground doing that training. They took a set of maps. So it's not about the technology, it's about understanding how to think spatially and use the technology. They used this map and a series of maps in their county commission meeting. I wasn't there. You know, I like to work myself out of a job when I work in these communities, get them to the point where you can use these maps and you don't need me to ever show up ever again. They used a set of maps like this one and showed that if that highway was built, the toxic constituents from those landfills would migrate into everybody's neighborhood, not just theirs. The highway was blocked. The $13 million that was going to go to the highway is now being distributed for infrastructure development in the Wedgwood community. So that was a big win. We're working on air monitoring mapping in the Pleasantville community in Texas. We're doing mapping to support heritage tourism in the Africatown community in Mobile, Alabama. We're working against an inland port facility in the Turkey Creek community in Gulfport, Mississippi. And we did a story map for the Overtown community that's also being victimized by gentrification in Miami. And they actually took the base story map and now have a walking tour of the historically Black sites in their community. And when we first rolled out the story map, elders came out and said, no, that's not all the historical sites. There's this, that, and the other. And so now when you click on that QR code, you will hear the voice of a community elder giving you first-person accounts of some of the important historical sites in that Overtown community. And so they took the little bit that I did, went completely to the next level. And, you know, that's what we want to do. And so that's a little bit what I've been working on, and hopefully not too much time.
That's terrific, David. Very, very rich set of case studies to delve into on the geographic front. Let's turn now to Chris Thayer and hear about her work on the community-based literature assessment on toxics.
Sure. So my name is Chris there, and I direct a program that does chemical assessments to look at the impacts of chemicals on human health, and it comes up with toxicity values. But the scenario I want to describe is really agnostic to the question. The core of it is the process of producing assessments, which I would describe as taking different bits of information and analyzing in a way that helps inform decision making. And so what we've been interested in doing is trying to marry the best practices for doing an assessment with some of the new specialized software applications in the realm of data analytics in a way that really fosters a more meaningful early engagement and hopefully results in a more fair and equitable approach for environmental protection. So more specifically, one of the best practices for doing assessments, especially if you're talking about, federal agency level assessments, is to get public comment on the topic, the problem formulation. What is the issue that you're trying to address? And typically that's been done by, it can be a public comment process, and there's nothing wrong with that. But a lot of these advances in these specialized software applications really sort of let us make that engagement more meaningful. So what it means is that you think about conceptually, what is a problem? But then to actually do an assessment, you have to get very specific. What features make a piece of evidence included or excluded? And it's during that process where you go from sort of conceptual to the very specific. I now have to screen evidence to see if it's applicable, that it really brings into sharp focus the bounds of that assessment. And so, one example that we have recently is working on a project trying to characterize subsistence seafood consumption in tribal communities. And so it's a partnership between my group at EPA and tribal partners. So we brought them into the process. And then, you ask all kind of questions. Are we just focusing on the US? Is it North America? What about commercial seafood consumption? What kind of, seafood? And you have all these very specific questions that you ask that get translated into screening questions. And I think as a result of that, I think it was a win-win for both sides. I think, on the tribal partner side, there was a deeper engagement. They felt like confident that this was going to be scoped the right way. On our side, we felt that if we hadn't had that engagement, there would have been blind spots in our assessment. So, obviously you want to sort of catch those early. So that was good, but then sort of taking it a little bit further, going back to some of these specialized software applications that are really more like web-based, almost survey monkeys to help you screen the literature. We were able to sort of share access to these screening tools. And, one of our tribal partners screened 6,000 studies. And so the other part that was kind of unexpected is that here, as indicated, the EPA is a little bit resource scarce right now. So we were able to kind of power the assessment question, in this case, without using FTEs, without contract funds, by just sort of the inherent interest, of the tribal partners. So that's been sort of our experience, and we've kind of getting into this. But I would say that the Cochrane collaboration, which really doesn't specialize in environmental health, but it's kind of a key focal point in terms of best practices for doing literature assessments. They actually have a whole citizen science workflow where they'll have these challenges. They had one on COVID about really ways to sort of engage to address topics of interest. And so, I think they've really sort of developed approaches to kind of scale out and systematize that process.
Terrific. So I'm now just going to give a brief introduction to the advanced manufacturing topic, and then we can explore kind of there are different attributes, but there's also similarity, I think, across these different technologies, and the opportunities that they provide to improve equity. So my firm, Verio Advisors, I founded it to help entrepreneurs get better technologies to the market, meaning safer, more environmentally benign, pollution reducing, able to get toxics out of the environment, or be cleanup technologies for our natural resources, and have us, have a cleaner and more sustainable economy. Now, increasingly, as we're looking at new technologies and advising entrepreneurs about how to make them safer and more sustainable, we're also increasingly looking at equity as one of those governance kind of metrics. So on the topic of advanced manufacturing, I mean, this is a category of newer or emerging technologies, different from transportation, different from the way that we've manufactured in the past, for example, using additive manufacturing, being able to have distributed sites where you could produce materials that you need or parts, car parts, for example, on demand, as opposed to having a whole system of production and warehousing and distribution and transportation and use, and then landfilling or recycling those, being able to produce what's needed with much less waste at the forefront. Synthetic biology, another example of an advanced manufacturing technique where you can use microbes or other organisms to be synthesizing chemical substances and products, as opposed to beginning with petroleum, and working with materials from nature or designing materials that are more consistently operating according to natural principles. Nanotechnology is another area, being able to produce materials at the nanoscale, so you can use smaller quantities of those. Being able to use artificial intelligence and data analytics. And of course, this field of advanced manufacturing is also looking at how those are combined. So, there hasn't been a lot of asking of the question beyond AI of how do we do this in an equitable way? And so the work in this working group, and I should say that each of these topics that we're hearing about are subjects of issue papers that the work group is preparing, and we're asking critical questions of and investigating for case studies. And so if in case studies for advanced manufacturing, there are a couple of examples of those. One is the COVID vaccine. So that is product of synthetic biology using mRNA to produce a vaccine. That was part of why it took 6 months instead of 20 years to produce the vaccine. And also it became more effective because of using nanotechnology, putting a lipid bilayer around the vaccine itself, the mRNA, so that it could get to the part of the body where it could bring about immunity, so and not be destroyed along the way. So, I mean, that's a terrific example of how advanced manufacturing has been successful and helpful toward health, but then we've seen an inequitable rollout of that technology, of getting the vaccine to people who need it, and especially with disproportionate impacts on certain populations, and hesitancy. And so there's this sort of broken supply, and here, the broken technology is our distribution system and our ability to get to people who need medicines, as opposed to the ability to make them, right? And so just, a kind of an interesting example to be trying to learn from. Another, we did pull out synthetic biology because of its potential impacts as a whole category of manufacturing and production, and ability to impact agriculture and chemical manufacturing and a number of other health and medicine. And a case study that we're working on there is on cellular agriculture. And so this is the idea that you can grow protein in a laboratory from using animal cells or seafood cells or plant cells, and avoid the negative environmental impacts of manufacturing of large scale agriculture, particularly for large animals that we saw real breaks, I think, in our supply chain over the past year. Again, workers on the front line being adversely impacted by high rates of production and the poor working conditions. And so here is an opportunity for this technology to be able to provide protein in places where there isn't a lot of open space to grow food. But a real need to be thinking about issues of equity. Who's going to have access to that food? Is it going to be affordable? Is it going to actually be as healthful as is promised, and avoid the use of antibiotics and other environmental impacts associated with field production? So those are a couple more examples of technologies and the opportunities to improve equity in our society. So I want to start with, you're all doing such interesting work in very different ways. What are the barriers toward real implementation? What can help? If we think about this from a policy standpoint, what can you be doing? What could help your work have greater impact?
I'm just going to go ahead and jump in because there's so many technologies out there now for air quality monitoring so that citizens can take their own data and access it in real time. So the fact that there's all of those technologies out there is fabulous. It's accessible. Sort of on the high tech end, we also have, folks who have vans and planes with instruments in there available to measure every single different kind of pollutant you can even think of, including emerging pollutants or ones that are, used specifically at petrochemical or plastics factories along Cancer Alley, for example. So the ability to do all of this is out there. I think that in terms of one of the barriers, though, is do people actually want to find out about inequities? So one example is if we rely on our federal reference monitors and the goal, and the metric out there is to show that pollution levels are going down overall, then there is no incentive to find areas where there are areas of high pollution. In fact, there's a disincentive, to find hotspots because it changes the narrative if departments of environment are trying to show their advances in getting cleaner air. So how could they become more equitable? And that would be to use these tools, the trucks and the vans, or the small monitors that are low cost sensors that you can put in lots of different places, to use those and the data that's available from them. So going back to my example from Buzzard Point, which is a community with a concrete batching plant. There we're talking about PM10, which, is heavy enough that it travels only several hundred meters before it falls out, So a PM10 monitor over in the middle of DC is never going to capture the pollution that the folks are experiencing right there. So there's the spatial aspect of it. And if people can start to use that kind of data, even though it's not federally, regulatory monitor, to say, hey, this is an area that might need more investigation, that would be helpful. The other one is to think about the fact that these monitors give you data in real time, so that we can actually start moving away from the 1 hour and 24-hour averages as the standards that we think about for health. Because it kind of makes sense to me that what the residents are telling me is that they're experiencing these huge clouds of dust, and we were able to capture what this means in terms of spikes in PM10 that occur in several minutes, yet these get averaged out. And so people don't actually know sometimes the health effects of these short bursts of high intensity pollution. So again, getting more granular in terms of space and in terms of time, if agencies could start to look at some of those things, that would be a barrier hurdled.
David, is that kind of real-time monitoring something that geospatial technologies can take advantage of?
Yes, in fact, yesterday I was doing a air monitoring site mapping workshop with a community in Houston, and so we, even in a virtual space, were able to find places where monitors could be placed in the community that would, give them a better idea of their air quality. And so I just developed what we call an attribute data table that eventually we created a ArcGIS online map that the community can use and can build upon further. So nobody knows better than the stakeholders where non-point and point sources of pollution are. I could just give you a quick anecdote. A few years ago, I was doing toxic air monitoring in a public housing community, and we were specifically looking at toxic release inventory releases that normally come from industry. And one of the residents asked me to place they called SUMA canister. They're just a canister that sucks in air, and then you take the air to a lab and they test it for various chemicals. She asked me to put the monitor, the canister, next to a playground. Now, if I was following my basic protocol, very rigid protocol, I would have said, no, that's not a TRI site. But I don't follow protocol when I work in communities. I put the canister next to the playground. The results came back. It was off the charts in terms of sulfides. So it turns out that playgrounds now are not like playgrounds we had when I was growing up. When I fell off the jungle gym, we fell off onto concrete. Made you a much more better jungle gym climber because there was an incentive not to fall. But now this playground and other was lined with ground up automobile tires. Sounds like a good idea. Automobile tires are a plague on the environment. This is great. We can grind them up, put them in soccer fields and playgrounds. Unfortunately, in the heat of the summer, those tires volatilize. And there were very high levels of sulfides. And I did more research and found out that even in higher income communities, they've had to tear up soccer fields and football fields made up of these tires because they were volatilizing to the point that some of the children were getting sick playing soccer and football in the fields. And so that's one example of where we took the words of a stakeholder in the community and absolutely found the problem that we would have never found with all our degrees and knowledge and education.
That's terrific. Chris, let's come back to that initial theme of kind of, what would help you increase the impact on equity from the work that you're doing?
Well, I guess on the plus side, conceptually, our work is low cost, brain power. A lot of the specialized tools that facilitate the collaboration are free. So those are good things. I would say in getting to some more of the challenges, finding somebody to help coordinate and keep the momentum. I think, with these things where there's a lot of sort of grassroots engagements, if they stall, they kind of wither away. But if you can sort of keep it moving, then I think you really, you develop a little bit of momentum, and then people maintain sort of interest and excitement. So I would say sort of having capacity to help make sure it's coordinated. Institutionally, probably barriers to opening up the assessment process a bit. So here it's probably going to depending on sort of the end game of the assessment in terms of how internally sensitive those conclusions may be. But especially in these early phases where you're trying to carve out the scope and just identify the evidence, not actually doing analysis, there are real opportunities there. I think, to sort of really engage.
Great. And David, I took you down a rabbit hole, but I am curious, especially with Chris's point about coordination, you've got all these different projects with different communities. Zooks is in the same position, and instead of a sort of a project by project level, is there a way that you can increase the impact of your work by this kind of coordination?
I work with the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice, and we have connections to communities across the South. We've built the Gulf South Equity Consortium, which is a collaboration of community-based organizations. And I have to mention that Dr. Robert Bullard and Dr. Beverly Wright are the leads for all of this, and so what two better people to have as leads. But because of their influence, we're able to bring a lot of communities together, and sharing resources and sharing knowledge. We used to have, hopefully we'll then again have convenings 4 times a year, where we would meet face to face. Imagine that, and share and bounce ideas off of one another, because what's happening in one.
Uh-oh, David seems to be frozen. Well, hopefully we'll get him back in a moment. There is a question in the Q&A for you.
Was actually
okay, good.
Actually originated with Dr. Beverly Wright and the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. I mean, that was the original model, and so it allows for HBCUs in our tradition of service, our faculty and researchers, to provide technical assistance to communities that are being impacted by all kinds of environmental injustices. And so about 2 weeks ago, myself and another African-American hydrogeologist from Texas Southern University testified, provided expert witness testimony in hydrogeology and hydrology on behalf of the Turkey Creek community. And that's something that is very much needed in the environmental justice fight, because, Dr. Bullard's a sociologist, Bunyan Bryant's a sociologist, Dr. Benjamin Chavis is a reverend, but he has an undergraduate degree in chemistry. But still, there are a lot of social scientists and theologians and politicians who we absolutely need, but most of the problems we deal with are atmospheric, hydrologic, geologic, hydrogeologic. And so we need those of us who are at HBCUs to leverage that kind of support alongside our community members, which is part of our mission of Black colleges.
Thanks. Yeah, Zooks.
Tremendous work. Thank you so much, Dr. Padgett. But it also, begs the question of, why is the onus on the communities, right, to show or demonstrate that there is a problem? And oftentimes it's really challenging to do that, right? If I don't have the federal reference monitor, maybe folks at the Department of Environment might not take my measurements very seriously. So I think the question really is, yeah, the technology are there. I think it's fantastic that communities are using those technologies and they're making progress. But I think there also needs to be some action from the top as well in terms of what's prioritized.
That was kind of relates to a question I had for you, Shizuka, about the, you mentioned that there's a lot of different technologies, apps and sensors. Are they integratable? I was thinking about that in terms of geospatial data. It's definitely going to apply, Chris, to the work you're doing where you're extracting data. They're not going to be in a similar format. How can we make the most of these data that come from different places and are being provided in different ways? Do you have thoughts to share about how we can do that?
Sure. So one of the challenges, right, is that all of these different technologies, may have a different reading of a particular, pollutant at any given time, because they use different ways of measuring things, and those differences may become amplified in different humidity or weather conditions. So that's what makes it challenging to have so many different kinds of technologies. But if we can have some of them, like purple air sensors, for example, which are relatively inexpensive, if more and more people can put those out so that there's a higher density everywhere, then we can start to make comparative statements about where the air quality is better or worse, right? We're getting to that notion that, even though Washington, D.C. as a whole has had air quality improvements, not everybody's experiencing that every day if they're living in areas that are right near point sources or high traffic sources. So that's one way.
Chris, how are you managing that data coming from different sources, different types, quality?
It's been a labor of love, but I think that years in the making, but it kind of feels like it's crystallizing. So one is we have extensive discussions with other groups that do this assessment work. So the process of taking a study and summarizing the methods and the results, again, in the context of a human health assessment, you're talking about 2 to 3 hours per study, typically done by somebody with at least a master's degree. It's very specialized. It's very labor intensive. So this idea about if one government entity or one organization has done it, is there a way to house that information so another entity can take advantage of it? So it's been something that we've been working on, but you get a lot of conversations about ontology. What do you call things? And it kind of almost found like we were floundering for a bit there. But I would say over the past year and a half, especially with some of these more advances in the software applications that really facilitate structured collection of this information, we've made some big leaps forward in collecting information, agreeing to call it the same thing across different sort of assessment groups. And then therefore you have like repositories. So we work with ATSCR, the National Toxicology Program, the European Food Safety Authority. And now we're in a position where I hope we build it, they will come, in the sense that we have a pretty good structured data collection forms. We make them available. And then what we're finding is that academic groups, certain industry groups are also trying to do their work, and they're asking for access to our forms. So it'll take a while, but I do feel like it's kind of gelling. And then sort of one layer on top of that is that we're using that structured format to now say, if we collect these entities, now can we bring to bear the artificial intelligence approaches to collect that information from the full text so that we reduce the people hours. So the artificial intelligence, again, is really sort of coming into play here now that we have more stability about the entities.
I'm thinking about, in these various contexts. So David, in the geospatial context, you talked about how these maps come with, they're very personal. It sounds like they're based on people's life experience and memory and history. And, how do you deal with all these different kinds of data, and how can we make them more accessible and more available to people to use and learn from?
Yes, the issue with I guess geospatial technology resources is not is not the lack of availability. I mean, we have a policy map, and there's the Centers for Disease Control has their places maps program, which is excellent. And then of course, the EPA has EnviroMapper and the Environmental Justice Screening Tool. And then other states such as, Maryland has their Maryland Enviro Screen, Michigan has Michigan Enviro Screen, California has Cal Enviro Screen, Houston has their own Enviro Screen. So there's no lack of free, open mapping resources. However, the user friendliness is an issue. Although products like EJ Screen, the Environmental Justice Screening Tool, is an open source, but either we or I know the federal government used to, at least in Region 4, I don't know what about the other regions, did have training programs and tutorials for EJ Screen. I mean, EJ Screen is supposed to be used by community stakeholders. However, if you have someone who's working as a cafeteria server or crossing guard or postal worker who doesn't look at maps all the time like I do, and you put them in front of a map, chances are they're not just going to leap in there and start adding layers and so on and so forth. But if you take maybe a 30-minute hands-on workshop, that's all it takes. It's all it takes. But without that, it can be quite daunting. And so, that's so. Like I said, there's so many tools out there. I've compiled clearinghouses on several occasions. I actually built an environmental justice mapping tool clearinghouse for the U.S. Department of Energy a few years ago, because there were so many tools out there. But then we went about going into communities, doing trainings, so that mom and pop and grandpop and grandmom and whoever could use these tools. I mean, that's who the tools are for. I mean, the EPA recently did an analysis that showed that with all those tools I just mentioned, EnviroMapper, et cetera, the primary users were academics and government agencies, not community stakeholders. So that's where we need to put things in place so that people can use these tools for self-empowerment.
Great. We're coming to the end of our time. There are some questions in the chat, in the Q&A, the Q&A. So Zooks, I'll ask if, there's one directly to you. There's a couple about advanced technologies. So after our discussion, maybe you can take a stab at that. But just in closing remarks from each of you, are there policy levers that could expand or enhance the work you're doing? Or can you give an example or two of a policy lever? David just talked about training programs and tutorials. That seems like one very straightforward thing that could be done, but are there others that come to mind? Chris, let's start with you.
Well, I would echo that one. That would certainly apply in my place. I think just sort of building it in as sort of an expectation, if that makes sense, and not just a one-off. Okay. Sorry, call from school.
Okay, we'll let you go. Good. David, how about you?
Yes, in terms of technology tends to be expensive. However, there are entities such as colleges and universities, especially public colleges and universities and the federal government or any government entity that tends to recycle technology every 18 months or 2 years or so. And in many cases, those pieces of technology end up as e-waste or electronic waste because the technology industry sees fit to dispose of these mildly used products rather than donate them. I was involved with a project years ago where one of my colleagues, I'll say his name, John Rosenthal, somehow figured out a way to get surplus computers from the federal government. It was an arduous, painstaking process. And so what we did was we took those surplus computers and placed them in church basements, community centers, wherever communities wanted them. One community, the Scarborough community, which is a Black community in the shadow of Oak Ridge National Lab and the Y12 plant, they had a lot of concerns about radiation, obviously. Nobody would come to help them, and those who came to help them didn't share the data. So we gave them computers. They used the computers. They connected with researchers from Russia. Russia also has a nuclear waste problem. The Russian scientists flew on their own expense and did environmental analysis and testing for the Scarborough community, soil and whatever. And so they use those computers to make that happen themselves. but they had to have the technology. And so that's what a lot of if we could find ways to leverage surplus technology, get them into the hands of people in Buzzard Point or South Side of Chicago or wherever. I mean, these people, they're not running, they don't need mainframe computer power. They don't need supercomputer power. They just need to just use Excel and get on the internet. And they can do a lot with that. So if there's a way that even colleges and universities, I know all of us have a building somewhere on campus where there's a whole lot of old computers that are just sitting there. I mean, we don't have any place to get rid of. We have them at TSU.
Right.
Just
Yeah.
They could be in somebody's church basement.
Love it. Great idea. And Shizuka, last word goes with you.
Oh no, I have 2 points to make, Joanne, so I hope that's okay.
Sure.
The first one is, even if academics collect data or communities collect data, it's really hard to enact change thereafter. I mean, we've been trying to get Department of Environment in DC, right, to either enforce or somehow contain or put in more pollution controls, demand more pollution controls from concrete batching plants, right? It takes years, and we've been working on this for years, and there has been no change. So if there is a willingness, right, to listen to the communities who are speaking and to take the community knowledge, right, that's one thing. The second one I actually mentioned earlier, right, which is moving away simply from focusing on the federal standards, right, as our way of monitoring and our metric of how well we're doing in terms of air quality, right? If it's equity, then we do pay attention to spatial distribution of air quality, not just is our regional air quality doing better or worse. And then, Joanne, wait, I have one more. And the last one is fence line monitoring. I was at an environmental justice conference, the first one I ever got to go to in New Orleans, and I wish I remember his name because he was an EPA employee. He said, I wish I had never worked on the emissions factors, right, for industries. In lieu of doing actual real-time fence line monitoring, right, EPA is able to use for TRI, right, estimates of how much is actually being emitted. That technology are available now and should be taking measurements that actually are in the hands of people who are living near those facilities. So I guess those are my 3 points, Joanne.
Terrific. This has been a great discussion. We're a minute or two over, so I'm just gonna leave it there and look forward to our next convening to talk about how to synthesize some of the great ideas that we've just discussed. So thanks to all of you, Zooks, David, and Chris, for your contribution.
Yeah, and to my students, I'll see you all at 2:00 Central Time. Central Time. So thanks for coming. Thanks for attending. Hopefully you got a taste of how this all works in the real world, so-called real world. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks, Joanne and David and Zooks and Chris. I think shows the number of opportunities, but also the challenges in using technology to promote greater equity. And so again, we're less focused on the technology part of it, but the ways in which technology are used and people's capacity to understand different kinds of technologies, monitoring, whatever the effects of different new technologies on equity and so on. So we're going to take some time to hear thoughts and questions people have, and I hope that our panelists can stay with us for part of this. But William K. Riley chairs the advisory panel for this project. We've been working with Bill for about 8 years now. We established the William K. Riley fund and program on environmental leadership. We do annual environmental leadership awards and annual scholarships for our Master of Public Policy, Master of Public Administration students. And I know it's a cliche, but I don't think Bill Riley needs an introduction beyond that for this audience. Of course, former EPA administrator, former co-chair of President Obama's oil spill commission, former president of the World Wildlife Fund US. So it stayed very active on a variety of environmental issues. And so we're very pleased to be able to work with Bill and generally, and especially on this project. So Bill was going to share some thoughts on sort of some of these issues and the conversation and the project overall. Bill?
Thank you, Dan. Well, this is a great session. I think of tremendous environmental achievements through technological advancements over the years. One thinks first of the catalytic converter, which was anticipated but didn't exist when the Clean Air Act was passed in 1970. Then the sensors that are so important in the power station stacks, which actually determine the abundance, the amount of sulfur dioxides, and are the basis for assessing significant fines in the events of exceedances. But those were largely industrial level achievements. They're not necessarily so specifically useful to people, which is the challenge right now. I think there's a great deal of data available. It's not necessarily available to a community with a specific problem that it may understand, but the data really is too aggregated or too large a scale to be helpful. I think of something like that I've been involved with somewhat with ACLIMA, the mobile sampling of air pollution in various places with the detection sensors on the top of, and nonprofit kind of achievement to get this done, on the top of the Google photo collection vehicles, which measure several sorts of pollution. In some cases, I know in Denver, confirmed EPA's own numbers for certain areas, which is also helpful. And if you get a lower priority for the environment, budget issues and the rest can be a corrective to a government failure to attend to certain kinds of pollutants. There are major penumbras, which over my career have flummoxed us. I know the point that was made that when the air pollution numbers are significantly declining in the aggregate, it's a little hard to get attention for certain kinds of phenomena, such as the increase in asthma, which has taken place over so many years. It used to be thought of very likely an air pollution problem, and yet in the areas where it was particularly pronounced, it was not necessarily a correlative, and it's very difficult to pin it down, nor was the data collected in a way that would have refined it to the local housing area, the nearness to automobile traffic and things of that sort, which I think can much more easily be done now. In South Texas, the incidence of very high levels of gastrointestinal illness was thought for a long time, and I think is in fact related to lack of sanitation, particularly in the community, in the areas where undocumented workers were living and did not have effective sanitation. But for an agency, a government agency, to undertake to analyze that problem, given its breadth and extent, would take a lot of political interest and support, which it just didn't have. And I don't know if it has it today. I think of the issue of non-point sources, which was raised, and with artificial intelligence, the possibilities of determining sources of pollutants, particularly heavy contaminants. They are contaminants by the time they get in the water, in the rivers, which are basically nitrates. There's a much greater ability to do that, to analyze that, but it has to have an organized purpose and community typically who decide that it's necessary to do, unless it's going to be the farm community, which wants to simply apply less nitrates if so much is washing down the river. I think the challenge, in short, and I think of the fence line monitoring point that was raised, invariably the argument with respect to toxics and fence line monitoring is that the toxics, if there were any, were trace elements below the level of regulatory concern. And they were at some distance, maybe 100 yards from the fence line. And therefore, it was difficult to imagine that they could be affecting public health or the health of the adjacent community. Rarely was there extensive monitoring at the fence line. It's difficult to do. It's very specific. It's requires a good deal of technology to set it up to do it effectively and to have it stand up if it's going to be the basis for a court action by a regulatory action by EPA. So it didn't often happen, and the arguments went on. The problem, it seems to me, is much more now the democratization of data than it is the collection of data. And the democratization of data is something that government can only be additionally helpful to, but not necessarily without an active community of the sorts that the panelists have been describing, and very well. It's a lot to expect, as someone on the call on the panel said, that the community should have to take the initiative to develop some of this information. But the reality is it probably does in our world, unless it can get the attention of an agency which believes there may be an endemic problem here, something that is on a larger scale and worthy of federal recognition or federal regulation. Some of these things will not be necessarily. I think of Cancer Alley, where we had consistent, this was always the problem with the environmental justice community. We had consistent neighborhood and community reports of the impact of pollution, the death rate from certain kinds of cancers. But when the specialists looked at that from above, statistically, they could rarely support or reinforce the clear experience of the communities. And that's where organizations like the ones that panelists have been involved with, I think, really do come in, because it is now possible to do much more fine grain sampling with sensors that we have. I was exposed recently to artificial intelligence in the effort to do contact tracing using facial recognition, monitoring the amount of time different people will have spent in certain areas and exposed to certain people at a radius that might allow them to transmit the disease, COVID. Well, and as was mentioned by the company representative who explained this to me, of course, this is just the beginning. This will be very helpful with respect to monitoring of other illnesses, disease, particularly contagious ones, infectious ones. So that's available to us now. And I think the challenge is to figure out how to get it out and to be helpful to real people in real time. I support very much this exercise. I think the panelists have made clear how many fascinating and productive avenues with real consequence for behavior and for quality of life there are right now. And our challenge is to identify them. And that's what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Thanks for sharing your thoughts. And of course, environmental justice became an issue. Bill was played a big role in putting environmental justice on the EPA agenda. So your thoughts are always welcomed on these issues. So now we would like to, what I'm going to do is give you about a 6 or 7 minute big picture of where this part of the project stands, and a little more on the different categories of technologies. And then we have a series of questions, and we're very interested in any thoughts people have on these questions, which we'll put up in a minute, but also it's an opportunity to share other ideas or thoughts, or if you have burning questions for the panel, they'll be able to stay with us. So let me just do this. I have 3 slides, the third of which is really a series of questions for you. So first, just to tell you where we are in this project. So the goals are to assess technology opportunities for environmental equity and justice, to propose measures and come up with recommendations for improving their use. And this is designed as a 2-year project, so we're at the midpoint on this project. So at this point, been a lot of interviews, sort of learning the lay of the land, identifying the leading technology opportunities, understanding the issues, some of the barriers, some of the topics that you heard about in the panel discussion, done some background research, and there's a lot of work to build on in this area. we started to draft some preliminary findings in terms of 5 issue papers, which are starting to come together now. So we hope those will be available later in the summer for people to look at. So the next step now is we're going to finish those and then have our subject matter experts give us advice on them. And then we want to move into doing some case studies to really learn what has worked and what could make uses of technologies for equity more effective. So that's sort of where we are now. This was the first of our 2 symposia. We're doing this on the technology work, the other in early June on the workforce of the future. And then we'll be sort of learning from that and moving on to final recommendations. But in the fall, I mean, there's so many terrific issues coming out of this. We see an opportunity to pursue select topics in more depth. So in the fall, we'll have 2 or 3 webinars on technology opportunities for environmental equity and justice. And then we hope we will be in person, but if not, we will have a virtual conference about a year from now to present results, recommendations, solicit feedback, and we'll be sharing this with people in agencies, people in foundations, non-governmental organizations, state agencies, and so on. So we're about in the middle of that series of phases. So if we could go to the next slide. So this, I mentioned these before, but the people you heard from on the panel are working in some 1 or 2 or maybe 3 aspects of these different kinds of issues. So we're looking now just to get a big picture and a handle on what are the different kinds of technology opportunities, looking in 5 categories. One is enhanced air monitoring. And so we heard some from Zooks on opportunities there and some of the limitations. And the enhanced is sort of air monitoring that really helps identify community issues and can be used more effectively by communities as well as government agencies to identify problems and develop solutions. I think David's story about the reusing tires on playgrounds was very revealing. Geospatial analysis, of course, that is David's area of expertise. Obviously, there are very good links with enhanced air monitoring and water monitoring. So we're looking at some possible case studies in that area. Advanced analytics, a broad category of really using digital technologies in various ways. So I think we heard from, well, all 3 of our panelists and from Joanne on applications of advanced analytics. And then we also heard about synthetic biology, which is a sort of a different application of technology. There are opportunities for more sustainable manufacturing, but it's a little different kind of application of technology than, say, enhanced air monitoring. And then advanced manufacturing, which is quite a range of tools, but different opportunities that technology makes available. So that's sort of the big picture what we'll be doing. And let me just turn now to the questions. We go to the next slide that we want to pose. But again, if you have advice in other areas, that would be great. So our first question, are these the main categories of technologies to consider? So at this point now, we're going to start focusing in, but I think it is valuable to have a sort of big picture of all the different areas that, or many of the different areas where technologies can help promote equity. In addition to the technologies, we're sort of looking to link those with issues and problems that would benefit. Any thoughts on what would be most valuable in terms of final products coming out of this project? Lean more toward giving a broad look at technologies and applications, or maybe focus much more on in-depth of particular opportunities. So any advice on that? And then are there menus that people are aware of technologies and applications to environmental equity and justice. So we'd be interested in hearing about that. So those are the topics we're most interested in, but we're also interested in comments on other issues or questions that you might have. So if we were all in a room together, this would be much easier. I would know how to do this, but what we'll do is we'll ask you to put comments and questions in the Q&A, and we will take those, and I will share your comments with others. And if there are particular questions, I will respond or ask others in our group to respond. So do have a comment from Stan Abramson, also a member of the Program Advisory Board for our center. Based on Bill's very astute comments regarding adverse impacts of nitrogen runoff, please keep in mind that there are new ag tech products in development that will provide nutrient management products that do not involve adding nitrogen fertilizers to the soil. Well, that's excellent advice. So that's something that we'll want to look into even further. Are there other comments? We have comment from Craig Butler in Louisville. As for COVID, there's been obviously badly done data collection when the PCR tests have never been correlated with disease symptoms. CDC and the World Health Organization have recommended different numbers. So some comments on avoiding false positives and proper methodology. Other comments or questions that people would like to bring up? Another comment from Craig Butler in Louisville. Using COVID again as an example, there is a need for best known science to implement when proper established epidemiology has been totally thrown overboard for totally unreliable PCR testing, which was never properly developed for disease diagnosis. So comment on the match between problem and the application. So are there other categories of technologies that folks are aware of, or sort of problems where different technologies have been used where we may want to take a look to just broaden at least the initial look? Zooks, you were commenting on a question. Why don't you sort of give us your thoughts on that?
Hi, thanks so much. I was sitting down to do some typing. Really exciting to hear Carolyn Dick Mays from US EPA. Thank you so much for saying, hey, you could incorporate, right, a lot of locally collected data into mapping. I'm excited to hear that because the feedback that I usually hear is that my data aren't good enough. So that's great that folks at EPA are open to collecting non-regulatory level data. And I think definitely your question for suggestions for how to centralize and localize data, that is a great question for Dr. Padgett.
So in terms of how to increase the utilization of data on a local level?
Well, you have so much awesome data, right? We take air quality measurements here and there. We've done community surveys about asthma levels, right? Where do these pieces of information go? And could there be some kind of platform where communities could upload this to map? Could we coordinate, right? The suggestion, right, is the question comes from, thank you very much, from EPA folks, right? How can we centralize this kind of information? Because for me, I'm just like, oh, I took a formaldehyde measurement over here and I took a, VOC measurement over here. It doesn't go anywhere oftentimes.
Oh, yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, there is in point source data can be added to EJ Screen. It's not in easy process, but it can be done. We're doing it in Houston. I've done it lots of times where you just collect data, put it in ArcGIS Online. EJ Screen runs on the same ArcGIS Online platform, and then you can just move that layer over to EJ Screen. I don't think that it can be saved. We can make screenshots and show, for instance, if community members were using low-cost sensors, such as, like you said, purple air sensors or some other type of low-cost sensor, and collected some data on the ground. You know, if they have the latitude and longitude and some other data that goes along with it, and pulled that data into an ArcGIS Online spreadsheet, ArcGIS Online platform, they could then layer that right in the EJ screen and see, you know, if their PM 2.5 measures jibe with the highest exposure indexes in EJ screen. I mean, that can be done. There's another tool the EPA has that's called, the acronym is RED2Go. It's the, I can't remember what it stands. It's something, but anyway, it's specifically a platform for communities to upload their air monitoring results and layer them against various health and other environmental data. RED2Go is not very user-friendly at all. It's more of an advanced tool. I'm not sure if data can be layered into EnviroMapper. EnviroMapper was recently updated, and I haven't really played with it that much. Perhaps so, but I absolutely know that community-based data can be layered in the EJ screen. And I think the policy map, the only thing with policy map is you need a subscription. It's a subscription-based online mapping service. But I'm pretty sure that community-based data can be layered into policy map also.
Yeah, so just really quick, David, I mean, communities can overlay their data, but can those become publicly available?
I mean, if there was a collaborative that shared their data, yeah, like I said, the only thing about EJ Screen is that, you know, you can't save the data in that platform. That's the only thing. Okay. So technically, you could have a series of, or collaborative of, stakeholders and community-based organizations contribute to one ArcGIS Online account and just have someone manage it, and then they could layer all their data from there. What I'm working on in Houston right now is doing just that. So there's all these community-based organizations. Some of them have clarity monitors. Some of them have purple air monitors. The Harris County is working with community-based. There's all these monitors out there, and they're on different platforms. And what we're trying to do now, working with the Air Alliance Houston, is pull all these community-based sensors together onto one platform. It's not easy, but we're getting there. We're getting there, and it's because some of the like the clarity monitors come with their own platform. The purple air monitors come with their own map platform, and so it's possible to get the monitor locations on the one map collectively, but it would take a lot of programming to get them to show their real-time data. I'm sure it can be done, but yeah, we do have someone who's doing all that coding right now to get to that point, but it's not something that you could fall off a turnip truck and do, you know.
Yeah, we have another comment from Carolyn Mays from EPA. I think these technologies are great, but we need to make that data accessible to communities, to regulators, to NGOs, anyone who can positively impact environmental justice. And I think a lot of, in our interviews and discussions with people, we're hearing a lot about community capacity. There are always issues with funding, with access to expertise. David mentioned the importance of training, even sort of some basic training can go a long way. So just, and any thoughts from the audience, but also from a panel on how do you empower communities? I mean, should there be appropriations that fund community organizations? Can universities help fill a gap? What are some different thoughts on how to sort of connect these technologies, which have lots and lots of potential, to the communities that are affected by environmental problems?
Yeah, I'd like to take a shot at that one. So all of us who are in academic institutions compete for grants. As I said, you got NSF, EPA, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And again, taking the model from my mentors, Dr. Wright and Dr. Bullard, we should always align our grants for community stakeholders. And sometimes that goes outside of standard practice. But, if we're going to expect for these communities to continue to volunteer their time, which they'll never get back, to help us with our research, then we should, put them on the payroll in some capacity. And so if you look at the, Dr. Beverly Wright's community model, the stakeholders, community-based organizations always have some compensation built into that proposal. And even the young people have that, have them built into the proposal for summer research opportunities and so on and so forth. And even with capacity. I'm talking with some organizations right now about, the same thing. How do we build capacity for stakeholder organizations? And so one option, of course, is to have funds flow through the institution to the organizations. And we know that that's not a smooth process. Usually, depending upon where you are, if you're at a large public institution, the process of purchasing can be a nightmare. And if we're at a minority serving institution, it can be even stickier. And so the question from these nonprofit organizations that wish to contribute to the cause of environmental injustice or the cause to fight against environmental injustice and so on and so forth was, should we build our funding arms for payments through academic institutions or cash payments directly to the community partners and community-based organizations and stakeholders? I said, no, send the check straight to them. Don't send it to us. They might not ever see it, because by the time we fumble around with it at our institutions, then the grant period runs out. Now you're asking for a no-cost extension. People in the community don't have time for that. There's a much more greater sense of urgency. And so if it can be arranged for funders collaborating or funding institutions to make direct payments to our community partners, that way they can build technological capacity without having to go through some of our academic nonsense. We can afford to wait 6 months to get a bank of computers or whatever it is we need. And sometimes people in the community, 6 months, and you could lose half the children in the neighborhood in that time to whatever ills are out there. If you're trying to build a technology program for kids, you just lose people's attention in that time and they'll move on to something else. So just easing the transfer of funds for building capacity to communities is something that we absolutely should focus upon.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I hope there'll be some recommendations relating to that. Another question, which I'll start with Joanne, because I think she's a risk assessment person. So it would be especially helpful if we could centralize public health data such that we could overlay pollutant loading with public health data. That's a really interesting idea. And I know some people are thinking about that, and that came up in one of our interviews. Do you have any thoughts on that, Joanne?
I do. I've seen attempts on this about, for years, and how to, and that was, that was part of the question that I was asking to the panel earlier about, when you get different types of data. I know I have trouble working, with Google on my iPhone and trying to integrate it with my PC, and the things just don't translate that well, and it seems like a real barrier here, where resources are narrow and there's always a need for more. I have to say, I love that idea of the communiversity. I think that's a terrific way to be thinking about kind of accessibility, beyond the ivory tower, right? And how do you make information open and available? I'm involved in a project in Europe, and they're doing a particularly good job there in the nano safety clusters, where they've built up an ontology of data types. And I attended a 2-hour training yesterday on how all these data, and this is a huge interdisciplinary team from sociologists to toxicologists to material scientists, all generating different types of data and different models in different laboratories. And we're all going to have a standard way of reporting those data, and they're going to be open access because they're publicly funded. We ought to be making sure that, especially when these are government funded projects, that we as taxpayers, we as a society get access to the data that we're generating, right? And in a format that we can use. And so I think there's some good models out there, definitely something that we should be looking at in terms of our sort of policy levers, our recommendations for how we can.
Okay, yeah, that's good advice. Zooks, you had a comment.
Oh, I just got really excited also by that idea of layering public health data. So in our community, we were looking at a strip of public housing that was surrounded by much higher income areas. And so when DC did a health analysis of, potential health impacts or vulnerable populations in that area, they were like, oh, the asthma levels aren't that much higher than the rest of DC, right? Because they had zip code level data, right? So we need more granular health data, just like we need more granular air quality data. And those things go so hand in hand. So your suggestion of mapping the two of those, right, is just fantastic. So then I was thinking about the fact that we had a really hard time, collecting surveys from, residents. And I teach at a university that has students who would love to go out and do that kind of survey work. So if there were some kind of standard health survey set of questions, right, from an agency that was out there, and people could start filling that out and start populating a data set, I don't know, that would be amazing. And that could be a new citizen science project. For example, there's all these citizen science projects online. And if we, folks teaching start to adopt some of those, or even like high school teachers, wow, I think we could collect data. Sorry, I just got excited by that question. Thank you very much.
Excellent. We have a comment from Chet Whalen, which is interesting. What about open source software that could be made available to any community? Maybe take the work David is doing in Houston and somehow provide a common platform communities could access. This seems like an IT problem that could be overcome with the right resources. Any thoughts on some form of open source software that could help enable community groups to use data like this?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's the technology exists. It's just, hurting all the cats. That's the hard part. Because you know, the I was working with the community, several communities in Houston, and they were all participants in essentially the Houston Enviro Screen project, which is basically taking EJ Screen. EJ Screen, because it's a national based tool, doesn't include health data. And so California and Michigan and Maryland and now Houston have created their own EJ screens that include like asthma data and all the other data that's collected by local health departments. I had no idea. I've been working with these people for 2 years. And I was on a panel with a woman from Texas A&M who was heading up the Houston Enviro Screen project, and I'm sitting there and I'm looking at my community partners' photographs in her presentation. I had no idea. So there's so many people out there doing so many things that it's just hard to track down who's doing what. And then you have the city of Houston versus Harris County, and they're both. So yeah, the technology exists. I mean, we're working on that literally right now, getting everybody who's got a sensor out there somewhere. I guess probably the best example of something like that is the Weather Underground. So like Weather Underground is this site that just anybody that has a weather station, just put your weather station on it. It's a great tool for looking at weather variability across the city. But and I don't know what the management with that, but the weather. I mean, Weather Underground is probably the closest example of that. If we had like a sensor underground, that would be the equivalent to the Weather Underground. But I don't know the sensor technology, like I said, if you could have it all stream in real time, like the weather stations do. I mean, the weather stations kind of collect the same thing, but then you've got, some monitors that do volatile organic chemicals, and others that just do criteria pollutants, and others that do whatever. So I don't know, but if you had like the equivalent of the Weather Underground for sensors and put it out there and made it user friendly enough that anyone with a sensor could put it on the sensor underground, then yeah, that would be great.
Yeah. Okay. So we're gonna wrap up. We have one more question for you, Zooks, and then we'll pull this together. But is your idea something you have funding for that you could propose to Zoomiverse for a citizen science project?
Gosh, no. I mean, the question sort of came up with that idea, but maybe it's already out there, right? There's so, like David said, there's so much stuff going on. Maybe it's already out there.
Yeah, and part of the idea of sessions like this is to learn about other things going on and help make these connections. Okay, well, we're going to, let me just tell you about a few upcoming programs. Later today, yes, thank you again to our sponsors, the New York Community Trust and Intel Corporation. And then a couple of events that are coming up later today. We have the last in our series of 5 webinars on decarbonization. So that's at 5:30 to 7 today. So you may still be able to register for that if you go to the site. We are doing a parallel session on the Workforce of the Future side of this project, also in early June, not yet definitely scheduled. And then we have this year the William K. Riley Environmental Leadership Awards program will be on the afternoon of June 2nd at 2 p.m. Eastern time. And the featured speaker for that will be EPA Administrator Michael Regan. And we will have our award winners, which we'll be announcing publicly very shortly. But I think that'll be a great program. So thanks to our panelists, Zooks, David, Chris, thanks to Joanne, Bill Riley for joining us, our partners, Michelle and Jacob. And thanks to everybody for joining us today. And we hope to see you at future events. Bye-bye.